Hello and welcome. My name is Laura Stroud from the University of Leeds. I'm delighted and honoured to welcome you to this session. We've got three dedicated and superb leading educators to outline some of the exciting innovations that have been developed with and on behalf of the heads of teaching of primary care. We've got three presenters. I'm sure Professor Joe Rosenthal from UCL does not need an introduction from me. He'll be very well known to you as the co-chair of the SAPC Heads of Teaching, but I'm delighted to be able to hear what he has to say about the need for new approaches to undergraduate teaching. This segues into Professor Alex Harding from Exeter, who is also a co-chair of HOTS, and he will outline the National Undergraduate Curriculum Guide and Associate Student Learning Resources for Learning General Practice, which has been produced in collaboration with RCGP and SAPC, building on the recommendations made in the WAS report. And finally, we have Dr. Jane Kirby, who's a long-standing colleague of mine from Leeds, who will give an overview of the SAPC Medical Schools Council virtual primary care resource that was developed to help medical schools respond to student need as in-person placements closed down during the COVID crisis of last year. This was a truly magnificent collegiate endeavour, and I'm sure that all of the things that have been developed from the Heads of Teaching collective and communities of practice are similarly going to go from strength to strength. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Rosenthal, Joe, in a moment, but I just want to remind colleagues that there's a question and answer, so you can use the tab on the side to submit your questions, and at the end I'll do another reminder and I'll try and wrap up and pick out some questions to field to the team. We also just wanted to say that the team are very happy to be emailed or meet in various of the virtual hubs, but people might prefer an email question if you've got anything. So I'll just hand over to Joe now.
Many thanks, Laura, and thanks to the Leeds team for inviting us to talk to you about innovations in undergraduate teaching developed through the work of the SAPC Heads of Teaching Group, known affectionately, I hope, in SAP circles as HOTS. And it's great to sort of see you, many friends and colleagues here, albeit virtually today. Next slide, please. So I guess the first thing to say is that much has changed in general practice and in general practice teaching over the last 15 months, but it's important to remember that much does remain the same. And in spite of the challenges we've all faced during the pandemic, general practice is still where the vast majority of NHS patient contacts take place, and so remains, in our view, the most important place for future doctors to learn about medicine, patient care and population health. Next slide, please. We also know, for example, from the RCGP Destination GP Student Survey in 2018 and other studies, that medical students' experience in general practice has a major influence on their perception of primary care and, importantly, on their likelihood or otherwise to choose general practice as a possible career choice. Next slide, please. Another fact that remains is that we have large and increasing numbers of students to place in general practice surgeries and clinics, and with or without the pandemic, this is a serious challenge as practices face competing pressures from service and also the demands of postgraduate and multi-professional trainees, all needing supervised experience in primary care. Other challenges face us in the medical schools, working with often limited resources to provide the highest quality academic, administrative, and importantly, pastoral support for very large student groups. Next slide, please. So the HOTS group emerged originally as a subgroup of the SAPC Heads of Departments group, and now includes representation by the heads of teaching at all UK medical schools and Irish schools. And altogether, we have representatives from 50 medical schools, including all the new and emerging schools. We meet formally twice a year and have an active online network in between meetings. Alex Harding and I currently co-chair the group, supported by a small regionally representative executive group. Next slide, please. And here are the main areas that we've been focusing on of late. And I think it's fair to say that significant progress has been made in all of these areas, largely as a result of the collaboration of this group. Next slide, please. So apologies to people with antibodies to, can we have the next slide? Yeah, thanks. Apologies to people with antibodies to acronyms, but we would like to think that the HOTS group really does deserve to be considered as a community of practice, defined here by the educational theorist Etienne Wenger as a group of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. And one other description which Ben Jackson, our Sheffield head of teaching, suggested recently is that in fact we could be described as a coin, a term coined, if you'll forgive the pun, by a computer scientist called Peter Glor in America, as a cyber team of self-motivated people with a collective vision enabled by the web to collaborate in achieving a common goal by sharing ideas, information and work. Next slide, please. What's certainly true to say is that in 2020, the HOTS group collaborated at speed in response to the pandemic in developing or building up a range of shared resources, almost certainly without precedent in UK undergraduate medical education. And if we can have the next slide. In a moment now, I'm going to hand over first to Alex and then Jane to describe three particular and related developments which have been produced by this fantastic group of colleagues working together with the support of SAPC as a whole and other partner organisations. The first of these is Teaching General Practice, which is the first national guidance for medical schools on curriculum for undergraduate general practice. The second one is called Learning General Practice, which is a digital textbook for students and teachers, which expands on each of the core principles of general practice described in the other document, Teaching General Practice. And thirdly, Jane will be telling us more about Virtual Primary Care, which is a library of 150 professionally recorded authentic GP consultations, each annotated by members of the HOTS group and their teams with learning materials for use in undergraduate teaching, and again linking directly to the principles described in the Teaching General Practice curriculum document. So I'm going to hand over at this point to Alex to talk about the first of those two innovations.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I'm getting a slight echo on my my device, so please forgive me. This is a little 10-minute spiel on two documents, Teaching and Learning General Practice. I think the first thing to say is a huge thank you both to the my colleagues at HOTS who've collaborated over a period of 3 or 4 years to produce these things, and also a big thank you to the RCGP. And it's really important at a time like this that we collaborate, be seen as unified as a profession, and I think this is a really good example of that. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so what's the story? What's the problem? Why was this work needed? There was a feeling and some stuff in the research to show perhaps there was a lack of direction in undergraduate community teaching. Some suggestion as well in the literature that this might be related to a lack of identity amongst teachers and perhaps even amongst the profession as we're changing so rapidly. In tandem with this, other parts of the profession, the anaesthetists, the surgeons, were producing their own curriculum documents about what they thought was important for undergraduates to be learning. And there was a debate within the profession, within general practice, about whether we should do the same. Is it so wide and nebulous that we don't need to define what we're about? Or is there a body of knowledge that we think undergraduates should learn about general practice? And that really hadn't been done. Finally, we were particularly stung by a piece of work that suggested that undergraduates were not being sufficiently intellectually challenged on their placements. So we undertook what was a quite an extensive kind of intellectual debate that went on in the literature, went on at HOTS meetings that involved all the HOTS from all 40 or 50 medical schools up and down the country. We did some fairly extensive literature reviews of the relevant literatures and appointed a core editorial group to oversee the process. Next slide, please. So what were the guiding principles that we were working to? We got a strong steer that we wanted to operate in general principles, that those general principles should be applicable to all the different medical schools. And also a strong guiding push that this should make some kind of recommendations about educational policy, because of course we're dealing with workforce here questions, and that needs planning. Educationally, it was a chance, as I've said, to kind of conceptualise what is the general practice knowledge base, what are we responsible for, what do we stand for, and that helps us define ourselves, doesn't it? It's also that we wanted the documents to be adaptable, as I've said, and to scaffold the clinical learning that takes place in general practice. And we also wanted to say something on the methods that were involved in teaching in general practice and not just the content. Presentationally, we wanted it to be interactive. We made the decision to predominantly focus on online. There is an idea about a paper textbook. Be grateful for suggestions if you want that. And this is a plea that we are short of images. And if anyone has any images of general practice and learning in general practice, please can you let us know. Next slide, please. So what were the outputs? As Joe said, 2 outputs: Teaching General Practice, which is a fairly short, pithy document describing the core principles that we feel students should learn about in general practice and guides clinical learning. And then secondly, an online textbook that examines each one of the core principles that we outline in the document. Each one of those core principles in the textbook has 4 sections: an introduction, why is this important? A core bit of information, the need to know section. Thirdly, what students can do to apply that knowledge in practice. And finally, a list of references and resources. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a general look, show and tell. What does it look like when you go online? And so we have, this is the Teaching General Practice, the short pithy document, now in its 2nd edition. Next slide, please. These are the principles that we feel is really important for students to learn. We've tried to organise them so in one page, students can get an idea of the architecture of general practice. What are the core intellectual principles that general practice stands for, and how are they related? Okay, next slide, please. The document also makes some conclusions and recommendations. For example, we recommend that 25% of placements are now in general practice. I'm pleased to say that that recommendation has been accepted and adopted by the Scottish Government. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the 2nd document, and this is the online textbook. Same kind of feel to it, a kind of corporate feel, I suppose, to the documents, and we've been fairly keen on getting it to look nice. So grateful for comments again on that. Okay, next slide, please. And so yeah, let's flip on to the next slide as well. So this is what it looks like. This is an introduction to what we call the physiology of holistic care. How does it all work? And outlining why it's important. You'll see on the right-hand side, you can navigate to different parts relatively easily online by an index that's there all the time. So next slide, please. This is now moving on to the need to know section. So this is where we outline the core principles and the core knowledge involved. Okay, and next slide, please. I think we might have gone on just one, that's it. This is the 3rd section, as I've said, so a whole pile of activities that students can get on and do if they're not being directly supervised on clinical placements, or activities that students can do whilst they're at the medical school. Next slide, please. And yeah, this is the final slide, and this is all about the resources and references. So we felt it's important that students have access to the intellectual heritage of what we stand for, and so that provides the final bit of each chapter. Okay, so I think I'm all done. One of the things that the document does do is highlight what Jane's going to talk about next, which is virtual primary care, which is a video resource document that exemplifies or gives examples of each of the principles that I've outlined. All right, thanks for listening.
Just unmute myself. Thanks for having me. I'm here to talk about virtual primary care, which I think has already been mentioned a couple of times, so I'm not going to say again about what it is, and hopefully you may have heard a little bit about that at the start of the conference. So this is an online resource that gives medical students access to an authentic, complete library of consultations with associated educational material. Next slide, please. So this resource is made up of a collaboration between the SAPC heads of teaching, which Joe has already given you a little bit more detail about, the MSc, who are the representative body for UK medical schools, and Knickerbocker Glory, who are the TV production company behind the TV show GPs Behind Closed Doors. And it was about 12 months ago that this group came together under this common goal of trying to support medical students who've not had access to this pre-pandemic primary care consultations. And working with these partners, we developed this unique resource in under 6 months from the point at which we started developing it to the point at which we created it in its entirety. So next slide, please. So why am I calling it unique? What's unique about this resource? Well, it's unique simply in its existence. We don't know of any other video library of authentic consultations that are for use solely in education at this scale. But we think there are 4 things that make this unique. So the high quality footage, that's the key thing. That's by far and away the biggest asset to this resource. The associated educational content that we've developed at a national level linked to national guidance, like things like the Outcomes for Graduates curriculum documents, that it's freely available to all medical schools in the UK, but also this flexibility of the resource so different schools can use it in different ways. So I'm going to take each one of these in turn in a little more detail. Next slide, please. So as I said, by far and away, working with a TV production company was the biggest asset and remains the biggest asset of this resource. So the quality of the footage is what's incredible. And to get this footage, they have 4 cameras in each room, so a camera in each corner. They have cameras outside the building. They have cameras in the waiting rooms. They have a production team that are on site the entire time. They have remote controlled cameras so that they can change the feed to get the right shots as the consultation goes on, even to the point of the quality of the sound by changing the roof tiles to make sure the acoustics are right. And I wish we could show you the footage because of the quality of the footage. But the consultations that we use are all consented for use on TV. But when they use them on TV shows, they cut them to only maybe 2 or 3 minutes. But what we've got is the complete, entire, unedited version. And for this reason, they are authentic, real consultations that occurred. So they have to stay behind a firewall. So unfortunately, today I won't be able to show you the quality of the videos. But to try and describe some of the educational content we've got. So, for example, there is one consultation where a GP sees a young baby with the mum and dad and makes a decision, a reasonable decision. The parents go out with the child, and then the GP, you can see, is sort of sat thinking on their computer, and they suddenly pick up the phone and they ring reception, and then you have an image of reception speaking about whether the patient is in the waiting room, and they're not. And then you have a medical student who sat in with the doctor running out and going and finding the parents and the child in the car park outside the surgery. And then you see the patient come back with their parents and the discussion around why the GP has changed their mind. So educationally for us, that's phenomenal. So to try and give you a bit of an idea of what it looks like, because there's the videos and then there's the educational content that was developed with colleagues across 30 different medical schools, over 70 different contributors. The next slide has a video, which is just going to be a brief run-through overview of what the platform looks like. Firstly, I'm just going to show you that you can just scroll through all the 150 videos, but to make it a bit more simple, there are some functions within the website. So firstly, you could search just by typing. So you can see here, I could search for anxiety and hit the search button, and there you go, it's filtered down to 21 videos.
You could also click on one of our keywords. So, for example, again, if you wanted to look at anxiety or consultations involving a neck lump, you can click that and you'll see, again, it filters it down to 2 videos. Or you can use the filter function itself, which has 3 separate drop-downs. So if you wanted to filter for clinical condition, for example, and you decided you wanted to do an ear, nose and throat tutorial, you could click on that and filter the videos for ear, nose and throat, and you'll see it brings up 16 videos.
So I hope that video gave you a brief overview of what the platform does look like. And as you can see, it's also mapped to the Teaching General Practice resource, which Alex mentioned earlier. So you could look for something like complexity. You want to teach about complexity of medicine in primary care. So you could select out videos that are tagged for things like complexity. So it's available across the UK. The decision was made very early in the project that this resource would be made available to all medical schools, whether or not they'd had the capacity to contribute to the resource. So this week, just now, we've reached the 1 million minutes viewed milestone, which is huge. And the expectation is that this resource will be used after the pandemic as these pressures, post-pandemic pressures ease. The nationwide contribution is also key. Different academics offering different skills to the resource in true collaboration, which was again facilitated by the SAPC HOTS group that's been mentioned. Next slide, please. It's also important that this resource is flexible. So some schools used it to replace all clinical placement activity for part of the course, some for students who were shielding, some as a teaching resource for clinical skills, but its flexibility was key. We've mentioned the authenticity before, which is really important. And it's also key that it represented different populations. So working with the producers, we had a sort of a wish list of things we wanted to cover. So we wanted to make sure there's a diverse range of consultations. So we have consultations across language barriers, about transgender health, mental health, safeguarding. And we also have contributions representing people and communities from different parts of the country. So as one of my colleagues put it, they said they see a lot of LGBTQ+ health with their students, but they see fewer consultations across language barriers. So this resource can bring those different populations to different medical schools. Next slide, please. So it's new and we haven't embarked on any formal evaluation yet. It's developed at speed to meet that acute need. As I said, it's developed in under 6 months and it didn't exist this time last year. But we do need to ask some questions of the resource in action, but we do have some informal feedback, as you can see from these tweets. So somebody said, have any medical educators used this resource and what's your experience been? It's great, especially when access to real patients has been restricted. And we utilise this invaluable resource for shielding students. Next slide, please. And we were pleased to hear that the Chief Executive of the Medical Schools Council said it's possibly one of the best things the MSc has ever done. And fantastically, it's done it in collaboration with the SAPC Heads of Teaching Group. Next slide, please. So this is an innovation. It was done at speed. We've got some data from our HOTS colleagues, but we need to look at, that's going to feed into the development, but we need to move into some rigorous evaluation of this resource. So great, we've got an opportunity to speak to all these academic minds. So if you have any instant research questions or suggestions, we'd be very happy to welcome them in the chat. Next slide, please. But thank you for taking the time to listen. And if any of you want to access the resource, if you contact your local head of teaching, they should be able to do that. Thanks very much.
So I just wanted to close by thanking Alex, Jane and all of our HOT colleagues for contributing to these educational innovations and to point out that these have all been produced with essentially no dedicated funding. We've got lots more ideas for innovations within the group and our teams, and I think one of our major tasks now is to seek further resources to evaluate and develop further innovations to build the quality and the quantity of undergraduate teaching in primary care. Thank you all very much for listening.
So there are some questions in the chat bar, and I just wonder if in the last few minutes before we close, if there's a couple of thoughts. What's really nice to see in the chat is more collaborative ideas. So someone, as Matthew Ridd, is saying, how do they best share resources that we've created from it? So I think, again, this is a collaborative, and all of that is really welcome. So perhaps, Jane, if you wanted to respond to that. And there's also another question which is saying, whilst we know this is all consented for teaching, what about for research purposes?
Okay, so I slightly want to defer to Alex and Joe on the question about bringing those details together, but I think if anyone has developed any resources, certainly bringing them through the HOTS group and being able to share them is important. That's one of the functions of the HOTS group, is to share materials. So yes, thank you very much, Matthew, if you do have anything. So one of the things we've been thinking about was certainly looking at how we overlay the videos with any subtitles. But the other question from Adam, I think it was, yeah, thanks Adam, was about whether we can use it for research. It's not been consented in this setting to be used for research, but it's certainly something that we could look to, but it's not in our current licensing agreement.
So I think most of the other questions have been either sort of answered in the chat bar or are kind of comments, but before we close, I did just want to note that Amanda Howe has said that the Royal College of General Practitioners wants to thank everyone who contributes to undergraduate teaching with primary care. And I think that's probably can't leave on a better note than that. So I don't think there's anything else urgent in the chat bar, but we will be able to retain the chat. And if there's anything that hasn't been picked up in this session, we can certainly make sure that's directed to the right person. So yes, I don't know if you can come in. So I think it's Amanda wanting to say, can she just mention something? I don't know if we can do that.
I think it's me, Laura.
Oh, Alex, sorry, I'm looking at AH. Alex.
Yeah, we share the same initials. I just wanted to reiterate that the points that Jane and Joe were making, that the opportunities for research here into the intellectual process of defining the professional knowledge base, using best evidence, assimilating literature, evaluation, research of the impact of educational interventions like this, complex interventions, are rich territory for educational research. So if there were educational researchers or educational funders out there, please can you get in touch. We are, as Jane and Joe have said, this was produced at speed, without resourcing, and we could do an awful lot better and make an awful lot more progress with some funding and some dedicated researchers.